All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. This is Housing Equal Justice Conference. Just a few words, we built this year's conference around our Housing Equals Justice campaign, through which we are reframing homelessness as an issue of economic justice, racial justice, and criminal justice. Naturally, this year's conference will take place with a special emphasis on re-examining how we adapt our efforts during a pandemic. We hope you will take a look at the many options offered throughout the week and take advantage of as many of these sessions as you can. And also, please help spread the word to others that it's not too late to register. And if you are on social media, you can use the hashtag ATI2020. I would like to say a special thanks to our presenting sponsors, Bank of America and Zillow, who are making it possible for us to offer this conference to you free of charge. So today, the name of today's conference is Using the Past to Drive Social Justice. We have presenters today, Reverend John L. Selders, Pastor A.J. Johnson, as well as Dr. Fiona Vernal. I will now turn it over to Tanya Barrett from the United Way. Ms. Barrett, you are currently muted.
Okay, somebody had to do that, so that's out of the way. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session titled Using the Past to Drive Today's Change. Thank you so much for joining us for this important discussion. Today, we're going to talk about racial injustices in housing, the history, what we're seeing today, and then the current challenges in housing victories. If you joined in this morning, you heard Nan Roman from the National Alliance to End Homelessness share some statistics in her address. African Americans are more likely to become homeless than people of all other racial groups, except possibly Native Americans. African Americans comprise 13% of the population, 26% of those living in poverty, and 40% of the overall homeless population. Poverty rates alone do not explain the overrepresentation of African Americans among people who are homeless. And I just want to say that again, poverty rates alone do not explain the overrepresentation of African Americans among people who are homeless. So for those of you just joining us, welcome. Again, it's using the past to drive today's change. And today we're going to hear from a nationally recognized historian, a statewide organizer and leader, as well as a local catalyst for change. So our speakers are Dr. Fiona Vernal. Did I get that right? She is an associate professor at UConn in the Department of History. She's also an exhibitor at the Hartford Public Library and the Thomas J. Dodd Research Center, as well as a consultant at the Connecticut Historical Society. Next, I'd like to introduce the Right Reverend Dr. John L. Selders, Jr., who is an ordained minister for the United Church of Christ. He's the organizing pastor of the Amistad United Church of Christ and a founding member of Moral Monday, Connecticut. And last but not least is Pastor A.J. Johnson, who is the leader of the Urban Hope Refuge Church, and he's also a community organizer for the Christian Activities Council and the lead organizer for Calling All Brothers. So a very accomplished and dynamic group of leaders and change agents. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Fiona Vernal to provide an overview of racism and discrimination, followed by a panel discussion with Bishop John Selders and Pastor A.J. Johnson.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the conference. I am so happy that you decided to join us this afternoon, and I hope that you will find the discussion inspiring and you will find some ways to join this coalition so that we can all be a part of the solution. I am going to take a few minutes to give some introductions. I encourage you to put all of your questions in the Q&A. We will be proceeding with this as a form of a discussion through question and answer, and I will try to incorporate as many of your questions as possible, so please make use of the Q&A. In terms of a historical background, I wanted to talk about the long arc of history, the history of housing struggle that links the history of residential segregation, home ownership, lower home ownership rates, economic vulnerability, and homelessness. This long arc emerges in the era of slavery when you could see how space and geography were part of the arsenal for those who wanted to limit opportunities for social and economic mobility and to restrict the rights of people, to belong, the right to belong, the right to participate in creating a home, and the right to build a community. Across the United States, in almost every city, and right here in Hartford, you got a similar picture in the early decades of the 20th century. So close to the railroad stations, to flood-prone areas, to poorly drained areas, near municipal wastes, near the cemetery, near hilly areas, any area that was usually rejected by others as a residential site, you would find clusters of Black communities. So whether you were in Louisville or Baltimore or St. Louis or Chicago or Washington, Richmond, or right here in Hartford, you had these distinct neighborhoods of African Americans emerging. And sometimes it was a block or blocks, sometimes it was a street, but everyone knew where the Black part of town was. Sometimes it was called the bottom, sometimes it was called the Black bottom, or sometimes it was just the Negro quarter. But wherever Blacks started to set up their residential communities, a lot of these communities turned out to be really close to what was called the commercial business districts, or what we call our current downtowns. A lot of sociologists and social activists and those who would have been interested in discussing homelessness and the state of housing for African Americans in the early part of the 20th century lamented that a lot of African communities ended up in shanty towns as shacks in ill-ventilated huts or tenement housing on the outskirts of city. And that is not to downplay the really important fact that also in the early part of the 20th century, African Americans made great strides in establishing a lot of all Black towns and Black communities that were thriving spaces, where they could establish their families and their communities and their churches. And we know the sordid history of what happened to some of those Black communities, because at the other end of the continuum, even when Blacks are successful, you had a lot of resentment and racialized violence that's used to undermine those communities. And so that long arc stretches far back, whether we are talking about the difficult housing conditions that Blacks faced at the end of slavery, or the use of racial violence to undermine some of the advances that they had made. A lot of these areas that I describe were targeted for slum clearance in the 1920s and 1930s. And when those policies were delayed by World War II, they were eventually retargeted again in the 1950s and 1960s in the name of saving downtown and saving the commercial business districts through urban renewal. And so urban renewal came in and wiped out entire communities that was poorly administered. A lot of people did not even realize that they had funds that they could access for relocation. And so in our own Hartford, right, we're familiar with the coming of the highway and the coming of urban renewal and what that did to the Windsor Street and other Black neighborhoods. So long before there were formal procedures for clearing out these neighborhoods, there were lots of people who had dreamt of ways of getting rid of those Black communities. Before the 1960s, right, in Hartford, there wasn't a lot of places they could go. And so none other than someone like Robert Moses, right, who is quite famous for what he's done for New York. Even Robert Moses dreamed of ways to get rid of the Black community in Hartford and eventually settled on the idea that the only thing to do was to kind of keep them isolated where they were. While Robert Moses's dreams didn't come true, a little bit later on, they were able to adapt his plan and to finally get rid of that community in the Windsor Street area. And so in the name of progress, in the name of modernization, city officials dreamed of ways to push people away from the downtown areas and were quite successful in doing so. In our more contemporary times, this long arc takes us to the coming of a very different kind of community to Hartford. So Hartford is now a majority minority city. The vast majority of people who are living in the city of Hartford are African Americans, West Indians, and Puerto Ricans. And this community succession happened as other older established European immigrants community either fled to other sections of Hartford or left for the suburban areas which were being developed. And I would like to see this form of this discussion of community succession happen without the narratives of decline, the decline of Hartford that usually accompanies them, because this community succession was a form of social and economic mobility for African Americans and Puerto Ricans and West Indians, and all of these stories are not just about white flight and not just about the decline of Hartford. And just to wrap this section up, I wanted to remind us that in the latter part of the 20th century, there is a huge cast of characters that came to influence and shape the experiences of African Americans and Puerto Ricans and West Indians as they settled into the north end of Hartford. And it will take a huge cast of characters for us to bring an end to homelessness. And so if neighbors and courts and banks and municipal governments, employers and housing authorities could collude in the 1950s and 1960s to try to limit where people could live, could work, or could attend schools, if real estate agents could lie about the availability of units for rent, if developers could just completely integrate racialized norms into their blueprints, and if the banks could participate by denying credit and mortgages, and insurance companies as well could code and delimit where people could live, I think all of these folks, the courts, the banks, the developers, the municipal governments, the employers, could be asked to take a look at their past and take a look at their practices and see how they could come together. And instead of colluding to undermine this community succession and to participate in redlining and to zone people in such a way that Hartford remains a place where there are calcified pockets of generational poverty, ongoing problems with the lack of affordable housing, and rampant housing code violations. If this cast of characters could come together, I wonder what kind of solutions we could bring. And so that brings an end to my very, very brief overview. I would like to turn to Pastor Johnson and Bishop Selders. And the first question that I have for you is, your work, your life history, your family history intersects with race and housing. Your community work is all about race and housing. And so I wondered if you could offer the audience an overview of what that work looks like, how race and housing intersects in your community organizing, and also what that looks like in terms of your religious ministry.
Yeah, I guess I'll go first because I don't see the bishop's mic off yet. So I'm gonna hop right in as he figure out how to do that. Amen. Thank you, Doctor, so much. My name is Pastor A.J. Johnson. It's so good to see all 83 of you all. I actually don't see you. I just see your name. So shout out to Marilyn, Marvin, Mary, Melissa, Meredith, Michael, Mimi, all you guys, right? Don't know you, but I love you, okay? So as a pastor, because I consider myself a pastor first, our church is located in the space that you described in Hartford, is known as the north end of Hartford. And there's a bunch of awesome grant words that people use to receive federal dollars to say that they're doing some amazing work. I can use all of those different names. I can, the north end of Hartford, the north end, they call it West Hell sometimes, right? But in spite of all that, it is a neighborhood that has been redlined by Robert Moses, as you have mentioned. And I believe that the gospel and community go together. I don't think those two are different. Growing up in church, they would say politics and church should remain separate. And for the ministry that I have taken over from my father, he passed away 5 years ago on a corner of Western and Barber Street. He believed that the gospel and community and politics are supposed to be together. He believed that you translate love into tangible services. And now that I'm the pastor of his church, I believe that you translate love into tangible action. So that's something that our church and ministry has been working on to build that better relationship, to have power in our community. How does it go together? Well, I think that community organizing, the way that has been demonstrated and taught to me, and the way that I output it in our community is building leaders. Most of you know or may be aware that I started a No More Slumlord campaign in the city of Hartford, which allowed the residents to have a more vocal voice in their community. And so what we did was we organized the residents, had them kind of get to know each other, and then built that power, which went to power around their deplorable housing conditions. So this is something that may not, I know Bishop Selders has been in the fight for a long time, and he has had a jump on everyone when it comes to it. But for the other pastors, they don't see how all this comes together. And so I believe it's our job to kind of show them how everything is melted together so folks get power and change in their neighborhoods.
Thank you, Pastor Johnson. Bishop Selders, can you talk about the intersection of race and housing in your community-based work and in your ministry?
Sure, thank you very much. And Pastor AJ, you know I love you, and we're brothers in the work together. Dr. Fiona, thank you for laying out what I think is the historical and legal precedent behind what we are now faced with. And Richard Rothstein, in his book, The Color of Law, he documents very, very clearly the way in which government undermined community and helped to set up what we now have. Urban renewal was a project of our federal government that states and cities took on. There were dollars that accompanied. Redlining was a policy of our federal government that then our local spaces and places, cities and states took on as policy. We have what we call religious districts here in the Northeast. Isn't it funny for you that you drive up to the North End, you drive up Main Street and there's church after church after church, or drive up Albany Avenue and you take the district where, in fact, Pastor AJ's church is right in the center of, and there's 200 churches in the middle of that space. Has anybody asked that question in Hartford? Why? Well, there's a reason why. They were ghettoized to be that way. Churches are not everywhere, but there's a whole lot of them in just a small area. There's a reason why. The reason that for me that this historical reference is important, and Pastor AJ has it just right. The reason that it is connected, in fact, for me in ministry, I came here to pastor in Hartford 20 years ago, in the middle of the neighborhood, the church I originally came to serve was right next door, right in the midst of two federally funded housing projects that had already been deemed to go away. So the church I came to pastor and the community for which that church had served for 50 years, that community was no more. Right today, what used to be a housing project is now where, well, if I told you I'll tell you where it is. Walmart is there now, and Job Corps. That community and the people who went to that church and that church served in that community, the community went away and had to reinvent itself. So for me, it was important that the church recognize and then reinvent itself because it, in fact, had to figure out what to do because the people that it served were systematically by government moved away. All right. So I want to say, first off, that it became a necessity of my congregation and then the subsequent congregations I have served to think about what it means to reinvent itself and move out of what is a neighborhood church to a community church, a ministry that services the community. Secondly, my connection directly with housing happened to be because I was also serving in the context of a particular concerns. People who are homeless for a number of reasons. Part of that homelessness comes because of what has affected them health-wise. And so I was engaged and involved in work that provided resources for a community of folk who were otherwise abled. And so it meant then that we had to turn our attention to, I'm gonna use religious language since I am in the religious work. We had to turn our attention to how we service the least of these, those who in a Christian religious context, we would say, Jesus said, Jesus said, what you do to me, what you do to the least, you do to me. And then his disciples in the gospel said, when did we do that? When were you homeless? When were you naked or without clothes? When were you in prison? He said, when you do it to the least of these, you've done it to me. That's the call of the gospel, as Pastor AJ referenced. That's the call for me and for, I believe, many of us who are engaged in the work to take seriously what that actually means in real time, not just in highfalutin Sunday morning time. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bishop. As you catch your breath, Pastor and then Bishop, both of you are making the connection to the relationship between neighborhood and identity and community. And I wonder, Pastor Johnson, if you could talk about how homelessness might be connected to other social and economic issues. Bishop mentioned the relationship to health, for example, and I wondered if both of you could provide us with a little bit more details about how homelessness is connected to other issues.
Yeah, so first I want to say happy birthday to Tanya Barrett. Like, we just can't forget that. Happy birthday, sis. So during my work in going in apartments in North Hartford, over 300 units that I've been in, and I noticed a reoccurring situation as it pertains to homelessness. I realized that people that are living in project-based housing would much rather choose deplorable conditions than be homeless. And you're probably asking, how does one get there? Well, one, you have to understand what project-based housing is. Project-based housing is when the federal government pays a private landlord a subsidy, a certain amount, to house low-income residents. That subsidy does not move with the individual, but it stays with the apartment and the owner. So therefore, the owner has leverage. Whether you miss a payment or how that the owner has leverage to then either go through, give you notice to quits, where that you're exiting the apartment, without just cause or whatever. But what I noticed is that most people who were on project-based housing didn't want to leave where they live. Even with mice, even with rodents, even with mold, even with all these things that create health hazards, they much rather stay there. The second reason they wanted to stay is because in the city of Hartford, there's a waiting list of over 5,000 people in public housing. And so if you had the choice to either wait in line behind 5,000 people or stay in this hazardous situation, God bless you, sis, this hazardous situation that is negatively affecting your children, unfortunately, you're going to stay in the house that, in that apartment. And so when we think of people that are homeless, a good portion of them, I can't speak for every one of them, but the stuff that I've seen and the people that I have seen are only homeless because they're number 4,998 on the housing list. And so what people do is they couch surf to different spaces to find some place to live. And so unfortunately, you have mainly women that I've seen, overwhelmingly, almost 90% of the doors that I knock on are women with young children with no male figure in the home. So young women have to make a tough choice on what to do with their children. What's funny is when COVID-19 came out, there was a new disease that came months after COVID-19, which was called Kawasaki. And Kawasaki started hitting suburban towns. And if you know anything about the Kawasaki disease, you don't know where it comes from. You don't know how you get it. It's just a random thing that happens with your child, just gets rashes and fevers, and it reflects COVID-19. So a lot of parents were confused. But what I realized, being knocking on doors and listening to the residents and a lot of the health concerns that they had, Black children were dealing with Kawasaki disease months, maybe years before it got to suburban neighborhoods, right? And so what we have to understand when it comes to health is deeply attached to where you live. And if where you live isn't what the federal government standards say, clean, what do they clean? What do they say? There's 3 words that they use that they repeat in the federal government: clean, something, and something, something. If it's not those 3 things, folks have some real challenges to work with when it comes to health.
Pastor Selders, Bishop Selders, can you talk a little bit about what everybody calls the social determinants of health and the relationship to housing, maybe through the specific complexes that you've been associated with?
Thank you. So for 15 years, I was involved with a housing project with folk who were otherwise able, and served with great honor families who many of them for the first time in their adult lives had somewhere to live with their name on it. All right. It's been a great honor to be in that capacity. What I found is that a couple of things. One, in order to get services, any kind of public services, any kind of entitlement, if you will, you need an address, and you need an address that you can get mail at to get the service. And so for what I discovered is that people would do a lot of things. This idea of couch surfing. You stayed at mom and them house. Your address is, oh, listen, I got grown adult children now, and their address is my address, and they live somewhere else, but their address is my address. And they not owe some of them entitlements, by the way, but they need an address and a permanent address so that people can send them things. It's a how our government restricts folk, all right, and restricts how help is given to them or access to them is a very interesting thing. And I think we ought to ask them more questions about how that happens and how we might be able to overcome what it is. What I do know for sure, however, when people have somewhere to live, they do better. When they have an address, they do better. I see Brother Roy has on a t-shirt that this phrase became part of what was a part of my lexicon. Housing is a human right. And I believe everybody that wants to live somewhere ought to be able to do that, especially in this country that is allegedly the richest country in the world and the richest that has ever existed, the richest nation that has ever existed. I think attached to that, anybody that wants to work ought to be able to go down there and find a job somewhere, be able to register somewhere and get a job, ought to be able to go over to the hospital and find a doctor and deal with whatever issues that they deal with. I think all of these what you call co-occurring issues are connected. You will find that where there is a health concern, there may be some housing concern, there may be some money concerns, there may be a job concern. They're all interconnected. And what boggles my mind, I think Dr. Fiona, you had this just right. We created a system of housing, right? That had lots of collaborators to create the very thing we are now trying to figure out how to untangle to get to the bottom of it. I fault and I charge anybody in public service, anybody and everybody in public service. We ought to be about trying to detangle this bureaucracy and this mess that we got in order that people get served. There are very, very smart people who are in public life and public service. They're very, very smart people who can bring to bear all of their skills to this stuff. It seems like to me, folk don't wanna. I mean, I charge, Pastor AJ knows this full well. I'm downtown all the time talking to our officials, our city officials. Come on, guys, figure this out. We can figure this out. We can figure out how to make sure that people have somewhere to live, something to eat, some clothes on their back, and a job to go to. All right, and we know when they got their stuff going on and it's happening, they will live better, and the quality of life will lift, and what I call human flourishing will begin to occur. Right now, people are subsisting. All right, COVID was just another thing on top of what we had going on already. Now, and I'll say one more thing: race has a big piece to play in this. White supremacy. And how white supremacy developed in this country came right here to Hartford Way, and exists in an interesting, tied together, knitted together, bonded fashion, so that this chocolate town, all right, can, and I say this all the time, how this chocolate town can continue to be led by white folk. Mm-hmm. It's just beyond me. Yeah, I can't understand. Our social services are all led by white folk for the most part. The vast majority of the leaders are white in a chocolate town. Can it be that we can take, I know my grandmama and them, whatever education they had and whatever resources they had enough sense to take care of me, to love me and take care of me. Right, and to pray for me and ensure that I now got education and have the sense to be responsible and take care of me and mine. I think we can do that and come together to take care of ourselves. And yet again, we choose other things and we choose not to work together to do that. I don't know if I answered your question, not Dr. Fiona, but that's what's on my mind. That's what's on my mind about how this stuff is connected together.
Yes, no, thank you. Both of you have been very, very clear that housing is deeply connected connected to health, and that there are some structural issues around the way that we choose to deliver services that can be a point of intervention, right? For anyone who considers themselves an advocate, an activist, or anyone who's listening who thinks that this problem is bigger than anything that they can do, that's one of the areas that they can intervene. They can go down to City Hall. They can talk about how public services are rendered. There's no specific reason why you shouldn't be able to access services without an address. As you mentioned, Bishop Selders, as you brought up COVID and Kawasaki disease, Pastor Johnson, there's been a lot of discussion in the press about how the state of Connecticut and other states chose to house the homeless population in the context of COVID. And I wonder if the visibility and invisibility of the homeless in the context of COVID provides any lessons for us in how we can address the problem.
Yeah, I mean, so I am not, I'm gonna be honest, I'm not the professional on the issue of homelessness and COVID. I do agree with Bishop Selders is that COVID did have COVID was a magnifying glass on the issues that we're facing, right? As I stated, for the past 2-3 years, we've been organizing for deplorable housing conditions, right? Trying to prove to the federal government, trying to prove to our local government, trying to, prove the dignity of these people of color who have been going through this, only to be hit by COVID, and now everyone has to remain inside of, some of us have great homes with some nice decor, with some Pier 1 furniture, some Bob's discount. Y'all got some nice stuff in these houses, okay? But you have to realize that when the government shut down and told everybody to stay home, one, some people never had a home to go to. Two, the places that they were living weren't the best conditions even to stay home and be with, locked in for 2 months. And so, although I can't answer the question regarding the homeless, because that's just not my area of expertise, but I can say that there were people who had a place to live that still lived like they were homeless. I want to share my screen, and I want you all to see what people are dealing with. Okay, what you're looking at, and I'm sorry if any of you ate lunch before seeing this, but this is a mouse in between a baby crib where 3 children sleep. In this particular unit, in this particular apartment building, this young woman caught at least 17 mice a day. 17 mice a day. If Bishop Selders was preaching this message, he'll say that the mice were eating better than the children were eating, right? And so what we have to understand is that when we think of homelessness, we can't think of it in its typical way of someone not having a place to live, because there are people who have places to live because it's their right and because of housing. But just because they have that place to live doesn't mean that they're living at the same equal place that you assume someone who's paying market rate rent, or someone, who is, your average renter, right? And so this is what people are dealing with in their homes. I really want you to take a good look at this, because this picture is only a testament and a testimony to this young lady's life, who goes to work every day, gets paid minimum wage, but she does what she's supposed to do, because we have an idea of people who live in project-based housing or Section 8 that they're just lazy, They don't do it. No, this young lady had 2 minimum wage jobs, in school, attempts to show up to every PTO meeting, but yet we still have a stigma toward her and where she lives, like she is the problem. She is not the problem. It is the mere fact that the federal government keeps and continues to give slum landlords opportunities to make millions of dollars and have children live in situations like this. This young woman has had mice droppings and mice in her bed with her infant. This final story I'll tell you, because again, I can't speak to the homeless issue, but this young lady might as well be outdoors with the way she's living indoors, right? She went to a food pantry. A good church member gave her cans and cans of Similac, cans and cans of Infamil, cans and cans of food to feed her baby. And with the mice problem that she has, she put it in the cupboard. She forgot to put it up so the mice can't get it. The mice in her apartment building ran through at least 20 cans of Infamil that she had to throw away. So what is my point? My point is that when we think of homelessness, we have to think about it in a broader way. Because if towns and cities aren't running properly, you might as well have people living in these deplorable conditions just stay outside. But again, it is due to the unequal housing that we have in most towns. Hartford, Bridgeport, Waterbury, New Haven, those are the only places that have significant, although it's that big, has affordable housing. But where is affordable housing in Glastonbury? Where is affordable housing in Avon? Why can't these folks that are living in these conditions not be homeless? Why can't they go to a town that makes over $200,000 a year in a median income and live the way the folks in that town are supposed to live?
Bishop Selders, did you want to comment briefly on sort of the disappearance of the homeless from the visible public during COVID and what that might tell us about the ability or the inability of the government to step in and mobilize to address their particular needs?
Yeah, I want to at least make a couple of comments. Thank you, Pastor AJ. Again, you hit it right where I was going to drive down that avenue, so I might as well get right in your lane and continue on. One of the problems that I think we got to ask some questions about: where are the homeless?
Yep.
Where are they? They are lodged in our urban centers here in Connecticut. Pastor AJ has it just right. Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport, Waterbury, New London. That's where the homeless are, because that's where the services are. You can't get no services in Glastonbury. Ain't none. Ain't no shelters, all right, in Avon, right? And yet, are you telling me there are not people who have a need for housing in Avon or Glastonbury or Windsor? You trying to tell me that people don't need who are from those towns don't need housing? No, they are sit here, and then we have to deal here in Hartford. And so I think since they are sit here because there are not services built to handle those folk who come from those towns, they come to a place like in our region. They come here to Hartford. Then I think it is incumbent upon our government and our social service systems to then think through how do we accommodate and how do we provide housing and other services attached to that housing that makes sense, that again talk about and deal from what I'm going to call a quality of life issue. I ask this question all the time, and I think it applies. I ask this question all the time when it comes to policing. They say it's a public safety issue. And I ask the question, whose safety? Whose safety? Vast majority of the time, I'm not afraid of Pookie and Ray Ray. They my bloods. I know who they are. I say that, and I know somebody gonna get mad at me, but they my kinfolk, so I can call them what we call each other, right? But we all got kinfolk, Pookie Ray Ray, and others who live on the block, who live in the hood, who deal, and we know how to deal with them. I think in a similar way, if we're talking about public safety, then we ought to. I like the campaign that has struck up since COVID. That not just housing is a human right, but not health, right, and race is a public safety issue, right? Because it appears that at least in my mind, we're talking about the connection of race and ethnicity and economics to the issue of housing, where people live, where they go to schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So y'all get my point. I'm sounding like a broken record, but these things are for me, they are tied together, and it is incumbent upon all of us. And I feel like I asked this question of at least my leadership here in the city of Hartford, since I live in Hartford. I ask the question all the time: what in relationship to the mayor, what has the mayor done in the neighborhoods? And I generally get silence, just like you just heard right there. And I generally get silence. Now I can talk about what they do downtown, but don't nobody live there. There's very few people live downtown. I'm talking about in the neighborhoods where the folk live. When you ask that question, I still got potholes at the end of my block, from last winter, right? And winter coming here. How come we can't? Anyway, I'm preaching to the choir. I know I'm preaching to the choir.
So Pastor Johnson, you expressed some underlying concerns that COVID has stalled some of the ability to organize because people have to retreat inside, and we just had a conversation briefly about the visibility and what visibility can do. Sometimes people say, either they don't know or they don't care, and we know that they know, right? So I wonder what both of your thoughts are about the recent discussions about the coming eviction crisis that everybody seems to be trying to forestall, and if the increased attention to that, to eviction as one of the major crises that's going to evolve from this time period, if that might help to sort of bring that spotlight a bit further out to the overall issues of housing, because both of you have defined homelessness as a much broader issue, right? You've talked about couch surfing, you've talked about inadequate housing, unequal housing, and terrible housing conditions. So I wonder what use you think the eviction crisis might serve.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I had the opportunity to sit in housing court in Hartford for a number of weeks, and I've never seen such a kangaroo court in my life of how power is distributed and how Black people and Puerto Rican people and people of color are treated in those spaces. I've never seen such hopelessness with a judge and a landlord who comes in with the city inspector, the lights, the landlord comes in stacked with police officers, sheriffs, and there's a poor mom who couldn't even know how to get to the court, who walks in because, she doesn't, she took, an hour off work to come in and handle it, but she's waiting for 2 hours and she's coming in court and doesn't even know the layout of the land, only to go up against a landlord who comes with a stacked bench of inspectors. I mean, all kind of things. There's no way this lady is going to win in court, right? And so when we think of this eviction crisis that's coming, what that means to me is that there's so many people that's going to be evicted without a fair chance to fight and prove their case. That's what that means to me. Everyone who shows up in housing court is not a bad person. Again, we have to rethink and re-energize, we have to find some new energy in 2021 on how we describe these systems that were built to be exactly what they are. And again, I apologize for speaking like this, but this is just what I see and what I experience, and I'm just regurgitating to you what is in my spirit. But these systems of whiteness that only bring in people of color, and I've only saw one case in like 4 weeks of one white person. The white people that I see in housing court are either the judge or the landlord, right? People of color are always on the other side trying to figure out how to make it work. So with this eviction crisis, we need access, real legitimate access to counsel. Okay, that is very, very big. If you're not represented the way that you should be represented in those spaces, you're not going to win, and you're going to be evicted, right? And so what we have to work on with this eviction crisis is making sure that we have true access to counsel. Shout out to CT Legal Aid, shout out to Cecil Thompson, shout out to all those folks over there that are pushing in the right direction to make sure that, I believe it's called a Gideon's Law or something like that, that some states are working on to make sure that during this housing court crisis, that there are lawyers prepared to take on the cases. Most people lose their cases and get evicted because they have no idea how to fill out a form. They have no idea that they can actually fight back in a meaningful way to preserve their housing. Most of the time, the landlords are retaliating. You know, as an organizer, just last week, I'm organizing a building on Garden Street, and the landlord out of New London calls the police on me. Lucky I was in Hartford and not Glastonbury. Lucky I was in Hartford and not Simsbury. Lucky I was in Hartford and not Coventry, because that whole interaction with the police and how landlords use enforcement officials to, you know, to come in and assess a situation that was obviously right. But, you know, just imagine if I wasn't who I was in this space, it would have been dramatic for the residents, the children, and myself trying to prove that we're doing something right. So landlords use evictions for their own uses, knowing that the resident or the person that lives there can't fight properly, or doesn't know how to fight properly. So what we need, long story short, is a meaningful route for folks to have access to counsel. They have to have it. This eviction crisis is going to blow up, right, if there isn't meaningful access to counsel, so they can actually go in those spaces and fight the right way.
I would agree. I know we only have a few minutes, so I'm jumping on in, Dr. Fiona. I would agree with what Pastor AJ just said, and I would also add that in the Q&A, somebody asked a question: what do we need to do, right? So I think a couple of things. Right now, what advocates and people like Pastor AJ and I have been able to do, we've used our bully pulpit to begin to tell these stories, to begin to shine a light on what's hidden in plain sight. Secondly, I think we need to do is, I think we need to, this COVID moment is allowing for us to have maybe a full-throated conversation about how our society and our systems work or don't work, right? So housing and homelessness is one thing. We got schools, we got a battle at the school level. We got a battle in economic development. Pastor AJ, you in that struggle with me as well. So across the board, there are a number of spaces and places that our society really, you know, COVID has shined a light on stuff that ain't working. And so I believe what we ought to be engaged in and involved in is ways in which we need to begin to direct our society in a different way. I think there's something wrong with people making money off of poverty in the way that they do. I think there's something wrong with that. I think there's something morally bankrupt that slumlords in one instance has the ability to do what they do and continue to make money. They just pick up and move their system to another thing, buy another building, and replicate what they do here in Hartford, in New London or Waterbury, you know, and they're coming from New York. Most of these slumlords don't even live in the city. right? So that's something really wrong. And I think I think what we can do is to get informed and then begin to talk with our neighbors, our friends, our family. We got to begin to tell these stories so that, and I believe people of good conscience, well-meaning good conscience folk will say something's wrong here. What do we need to do to change it?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for participating. We are going to have some closing remarks. For those of you who are in attendance, please continue to come out to the rest of the panels this week. Don't forget to register, and I will turn it over to Tanya.
Well, great. Thank you to the speakers, and thank you for all the participants who dialed in for this discussion. It was very enlightening, the history and also the things that we can think about going forward. I appreciate the discussion on the coming eviction potential crisis that might be coming, and the discussion about the conditions that people are facing, particularly in the North End, but in other urban areas where these are all kind of prominent issues. So I wanted to make sure that people who are listening and are interested in getting involved or learning more have opportunities and resources to look at. The panelists have provided some online resources. The first is Dr. Vernal's Hartford Public Library exhibition, which is titled From Civil Rights to Human Rights, African American, Puerto Rican, and West Indian Housing Struggles in Hartford, Connecticut from 1940 through 2019. There's also the federal HOLC redlining interactive map of the Hartford area from 1937. And then there's also the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness Race Equity Resource page. So these are all tools that you can find online. And then just quickly, some other recommendations that the panelists mentioned were about voting, having people get out to vote, register to vote, completing the US Census, joining local protests or racial justice events, and also engaging in city and town. I think Bishop Selders talked a lot about the getting involved in town government and asking questions about how to make change. And then just stay informed by reading, learning, listening, joining us for the rest of the week's webinars through the ATI. So thank you again, and also thank you, AJ, for the birthday wishes. So I'd like to turn it back over to Roy now, who's going to close us out.
Thank you, Tanya, and a very special thanks to our panelists today, Dr. Fiona Vernal, Pastor AJ Johnson, and Bishop John Selders, as well as Tanya Barrett from the United Way. This was a really amazing session that we had today, and very informative. Hopefully this was also a call to action for a lot of folks who were attending this session. So thank you all for coming. Coming up next, please don't miss our session on police, social worker partnerships, and outreaching to people living in the streets. And check your virtual programs for registration info for the sessions if you haven't already. And we hope to see you there. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye-bye.